Well, good morning, everyone. Yeah. I'm going to talk about assisted colonization as a response. It is merely one response to climate change, and a very specific one, and maybe not a very general one. It's also known as managed relocation or assisted migration, but we prefer the term assisted colonization. If you Google managed relocation, it tells you about immigrating to Australia in the 1950s for £10. If you look up managed relocation, it tells you how lots of people will offer to move your office for you. So we think these are totally misleading. We prefer assisted colonization. And I have to say I'm not an expert on climate change, but I have got involved through the whole issue of reintroduction and translocation for IUCN. In 1995, we produced these guidelines on reintroductions, and 2 years ago it was decided to review them and update them for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons was that assisted colonization was becoming a topic of discussion, and particularly in the United States, where academics were debating it and usually taking very strong positions, either pro or against it. And usually there's certainly still very little empirical evidence about its use and value. And so we've now actually come up, and it was approved by the SSE steering committee 2 days ago, with revised guidelines for reintroductions, but we've had to extend those also to conservation translocations. And part of the reason for doing that is to accommodate assisted colonization if it is becoming an increasing part of conservation in response to climate change or other major threats. It need to be exclusively climate change. And so this is the angle which I'm coming at assisted colonization from, not as a climate change expert, but obviously I've had to do a lot of reading behind it. And so to put the thing in context, this is the sort of typology that we have now for translocations, and I don't want to go through that in detail, but the point is the conservation translocation can be either released within indigenous range, and then it falls down to being either a reinforcement or a reintroduction. Or if it is outside what we call indigenous range, it may be a conservation introduction. And we see two categories of that. One is the assisted colonization, and two is the ecological replacement. And obviously for the moment, I'm only concerned with assisted colonization. And we define it as the intentional movement and release of an organism outside its indigenous range to avoid extinction of populations of the focal species. And this obviously has a presumption that we as human beings and as managers, we know what is best for that species. And that obviously is a major presumption. And this is obviously carried out mainly where existing forms of conservation are not going to be effective against whatever is threatening the species where it is. So we think we have to pick it up and move it somewhere else where we think we know best. And a lot of the stimulus for this, and one of the few empirical cases, is this extraordinary conifer, the Torreya pine, which occupies a Pleistocene refuge in Florida. It is only down to 1,000 individuals. They're basically not breeding. There's been no recruitment for 20 years, and an interest group basically said, right, well, if this is the situation, we'll pick it up. It was growing very well in botanic gardens in Georgia, about 1,000 kilometers north of its existing range. We will release it into Georgia. And despite the complexity of the US legal system, there was nothing to stop them from releasing what was an alien species to that state, in that state. So they exploited a loophole, and this actually, I think, was a stimulus for a lot of the more academic controversy on the subject. Just also while we're at it, looking at taxon substitution, which again we're going to see more and more of. This is just an interesting case of round island off the north coast of Mauritius. 1972, it was completely devastated because of the effects of introduced goats and rabbits, which mariners had put there as a food supply. They were eliminated, and the vegetation through deliberate replanting recovered. That's what it looked like in 2003. And the main grazer on these islands was the giant tortoise, which was extinct. and so they were substituted by the fork from Aldabra and put on there, and they have restored the grassland now from being tussock grassland with invasives down to lawns of indigenous species again, just through grazing pressure. But that's a bit of a sideshow. Now, our task force was to develop the new guidelines was of the reintroduction specialist group, but we also invited the invasive species specialist group to join us. And that is because the proponents of assisted colonization, well, not the proponents, but the process of assisted colonization, where you're deliberately moving species for some purpose, has a remarkable similarity to the history of invasive species, alien invasives. And global evidence shows that the introduction of species outside their indigenous range can frequently cause extreme negative impacts that can be ecological, social, or economic. They are often difficult to foresee, and they may not become evident for many years, decades after that initial release. And we probably all know as conservationists many examples of species being brought in with good intentions, and then something happens, they behave in ways which were not intended or expected, and we have dire adverse consequences. So, in general, for any translocation now, we are emphasizing in our new guidelines that you must do a risk analysis. You must look what are going to be the costs and what are going to be the benefits. Now, obviously, some translocations are very minor, they're very small range extensions, they may be least cost, least regret, and least risk, in which case fine. But you must still do a risk assessment in proportion to the situation. But where we are going to, or anyone is going to propose moving a species outside its indigenous range, then the risk assessment really must be much, much more thorough. And you have to look to see, well, the risk assessment should include the acceptability of that release by human interests, as well as the biological impacts. And we would also recommend that in any proposed translocation, where there is a high degree of uncertainty, i.e. you are not sure how that species is going to behave, or it is not possible where there is high risk as well, then basically don't do it. And you should always be thinking what the alternative conservation solutions might be anyway. Now, the point now where climate change comes in is that assisted colonization is a response, the proposed response to climate change. And from the biological point of view, we have to ask, do we know enough about climate change, or are we certain enough in our predictions of it to know where and when is going to be suitable for our focal species? And it's very simplest. The species may be in trouble where it is now, but if we move it somewhere else, for how long is the climate going to be suitable there? It may yet still be changing. So there are some very complex decisions about when to move, where to move, and is that the final stop, or is it again only going to be an interim stop? And many of the models of climate change at the moment are on a geographical scale, which are not suitable for many of the species that we intend to move, or may be most vulnerable to climate change. So we would always suggest that assisted colonization is not the first solution, but it may well be the last one, after you have dismissed all the alternatives. And the alternatives are area-based solutions, as we heard from James, look at connectivity, expand protected areas and so on. You may have species-based solutions. You may be better off actually managing and supporting the species where it is already. And you may have social or more indirect solutions. And we would also argue that the best solution for the moment may be to do nothing. Although the species may be on the criteria vulnerable, susceptible, and so on to climate change, it may be better off to leave it where it is. There is no doubt that we have very little empirical evidence at the moment of climate change and assisted colonization. About the only experiment is this well-known case with 2 butterflies in England. And I think the experiment was not done with assisted colonization and climate change in mind. But these 2 species were moved in the direction of climate change, northwards. They both had suitable habitat that was empty, and they were moved at relatively small distances. And over the next few years, both species established and spread. But the interesting thing is that they spread at a rate which was less than the rate of climate change. So in a sense it was successful, but also it was maybe an indicator that it's not going to be as easy as we think. And I think my thinking about this is that assisted colonization is not the first solution. It is not the most obvious or easiest one. And we need to know an awful lot more about the behavior of species under climate stress, when things are changing. There's a lot of evidence now that a lot of species can actually evolve rather quickly. We're learning a lot more about the pleiotropic effects of genetic expression during development. We're learning much more about the behavior of elastic margins of species at the edges of their distributions. And I think we need to wait and watch. We need to monitor species a lot more, how they are adapting and responding to demonstrable climate change, and then maybe make our decisions in good time. We also need to set up experiments. Butterflies are a wonderful example, a wonderful taxon for low risk, easy management, least regret translocations. The Canadian Forest Service is doing extensive experiments on forest trees because of the commercial value of taking ecotypes from within the range, moving them out of range and seeing the comparative performance. Obviously that's a long-term experiment, and if there are any adverse results, you just chop them along down. And I think finally what we have to do is to accept that we are living, as Lee said earlier, we are entering an ecological surprise. Things are going to happen that we don't expect, and we have to get used to the idea of novel communities, novel ecosystems which we may even create, and new relationships, critical relationships and dependencies between species. And these may all evolve very much on their own. So that's my take on assisted colonization, and I hope it lays it out, perhaps has a note of caution. And these are the people I would obviously like to thank.